Hello everybody, I am Ben from Team Panic. It is time to talk about how Temporal Displacement, my brand new featherweight Sportsman, went at ARC's Havoc 5, which is a 2-day Sportsman and other event that happens in the middle of a big science expo. And the entire crowd comes in and does a whole bunch of science stuff throughout the day, and then can wander through and enjoy some combat robots as well during the day. So there's not much really to talk about with Temporal Displacement. I will say that right before these fights, I had just got back from my UK trip, so much so that I got in on the Friday and started fighting on the Saturday morning. Also though, the Friday evening, I did change up the mounting for the angle grinder on the front of Temporal Displacement here. It was changed up so that I could put a bolt through into the actual clamp mechanism for the handle for the angle grinder, and that held everything in place a little bit more securely going into our first fight up against a robot called Pothead, which is an undercutter designed for the full weight featherweights, but is run in the Sportsman League with just a big old saw as an undercutter.
2, 1, fight!
I'm stuck on your pulley. Release me.
I think Temporal Displacement is a bit stuck there. He's getting a bit of a hit, see if he can get him free.
I'm trying, there's no grip.
I think we are stuck. Alright, let's give it a 10 count. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And Pothead wins.
Yeah, so that didn't go particularly well. I mean, the first problem actually happened before the camera started rolling for that particular fight, and that was when we loaded the robots in. I did a quick little test flick spin with the saw on the angle grinder, and the angle grinder nut up the top here backed off a little bit and kind of left the saw a little bit free running, which meant that I wasn't really spinning properly, and my first lot of spins for the actual fight itself, I was having to spin backwards to try and tighten the nut back up, which kind of worked a little bit. I mean, it worked enough to give me one hit, which I did actually scratch Pothead's pot, so, you know, some small victories there. And then of course we did have the nut back off entirely, and we did lose the saw blade, which wasn't ideal, but you know, these things happen. We then did hit him again, and he lost his weapon pulley, and as revenge he turned around and pushed the weapon pulley directly underneath me. And with the small red wheels that I was running at that time, the ground clearance on this robot was basically nothing, so his thin little pulley was all it took to high side me. He then did, of course, try and actually get me back out of that, and he was actually trying to knock me back off of his own pulley, but unfortunately the damage was done and I got counted out. But not that I was going to be able to do anything from that point anyway, but I mean, neither would he. Both of our weapons had gone down by then, so if I had come back out, it would have just been a pushing match. And I actually don't know who would have won that one. It would have been an interesting pushing match. Well, interesting in the outcome, not potentially interesting as a pushing match, because neither robot was really designed to do that. But of course, that does mean we took a loss. Going back to the pits, I got the weapon system mounted back up together, and I hot glued the nut in place on the angle grinder up the top here. I also tightened it down a little bit further. I borrowed an angle grinder wrench from somebody in the pits and managed to make sure that everything was a lot tighter and working a lot better. Which was good, because my next fight up was up against Polaris, one of the very, very high-powered CO2 flippers that exist here in Australia, and I think the only air-powered flipper or gas-powered flipper that we had at the event.
2, 1, fight!
So Glenn, the driver of Polaris, started that fight slow. There was a couple of good points, I think, where he could have got some early flips on me, and instead he bided his time and he waited, which did him the world of good, really, because it also showed that my puny little saw blade, attached properly and everything, couldn't really do a whole lot even to Polaris, and it's decently armored, and as you can see, I really didn't do anything to him, and as soon as he kind of got that vibe, that's when the flip started happening. And I hit the ceiling twice, which was good, because the first time I hit the ceiling, A, not much damage had been done to the robot, but also B, I was left upside down. So the fact that he kept flipping me was definitely a good thing, because I would have been counted out had he not kept doing that. The second flip that I hit the ceiling on also didn't throw me back over the right way, unfortunately, so I was still kind of dead in the water. It was that third flip, as they were right on the edge of counting me out, that did manage to get me back into the fight. Unfortunately, I was kind of surprised, essentially, at being righted by that point, and I was kind of in the mindset already of being over and done with the fight, so I made driving errors and ended up in the pit. I mean, let's be honest, I probably wasn't winning that fight anyway, but it did also show, again, that I need bigger wheels, and you can see, just by looking at the robot right now, we did indeed do that, because that was our last fight for the first day, and in the transition between 2 days, I put on the new wheels. But we also need to talk about the damage that happened in this fight, because after that second hit, the angle grinder was not looking good. It started flopping around all over the place, and I really didn't have the power in it anymore, because it was hitting the ground a lot. And there was a good reason for that. The handle mount on the angle grinder snapped. Just entirely snapped. It turns out that the head of this angle grinder is made of some kind of cheese-grade cast aluminium, and yeah, it busted. And it busted big time. So that one bolt that I had holding it in was apparently the main thing holding it in, because as soon as that broke, the pipe clamps also loosened off, and then it was just kind of free floating floppy around everything as well. So that wasn't good, and it actually meant that that night I also not only changed the wheels over, but changed over the mounting system and put on 2 big thick 10mm sheets of HDPE into the other 2 bolt holes, one on either side for handles, and then bolted them together across the back of the bar to kind of try and keep everything centered up and also hold onto 2 points, hoping that that was going to essentially survive, because our next fight, or our first fight up in the Sunday session, was up against a robot called the Whacker, which is a cricket ground here in Australia, and the whole robot is cricket themed with a big old hammer which is made of a cricket bat.
3, 2, 1, fight!
That's a very aggressive robot.
So, this fight, I think, was kind of the nail in the coffin fight for temporal displacement as an idea in general. basically it showed me that even working decently, the angle grinder or the saw blade in an angle grinder idea is just no bueno. It just does not work, essentially. This fight really showed that. Even at the start, where everything was working pretty properly and pretty well, getting the saw blade up to speed and then hitting something, it just ground and bogged out and just did not cut properly. It is bad, basically. At this point in time, that's all I really have to say about that. And the whacker is good. It did a lot of damage. Those hammering shots, especially against the angle grinder, re-cracked the cheese grade casting around the head of the angle grinder, and at the end of the fight it came out and you could literally put a screwdriver straight through the damn thing, which was not good at all. And it also meant that the angle grinder went down because there was a big enough separation between the body that was being pipe clamped to the frame and the head which was being bolted into the frame that, yeah, there was no power transmission between the motor and the gearing, which then meant that the saw went down. Which was not good. And we don't like to see that, but again, this is kind of that final nail in the coffin of this angle grinder to run, or a cordless angle grinder to run a weapon idea. Unfortunately, this was day 2, my spare angle grinder was at home, and I didn't really have any other backup plans, and I still had at least one fight to go. Although with 3 losses, I was very much not in the finals, so all I needed to do was get the robot running again for another fight. Rounding out this fight though, talking about the last little bits that went on here. Obviously we got pitted, but none of that really mattered because we were also losing a wheel. Now, this one I put down simply to the fact that I put these wheels on by essentially just swapping the entire drive system out of very obvious directly into temporal displacement. I didn't even bother to leave the motors in here that were in here. I just swapped the motors entirely to get the new wheels in place because they were both running on drill drive. And I assumed that when I had put these wheels on at Nationals in 2019, I believe, that I had done that properly. As it turns out, I'd actually missed a washer in one side, which meant that even though everything was all together, the nut was in place, the reverse thread screw was in place, that reverse thread screw had nothing to hold on to keep the wheel from popping out, which is what happened. Unfortunately, I didn't find that out until after our next fight. Between this fight and our next fight, I literally just screwed the wheel back on, applied a ton of hot glue to try and keep the wheel where it was and keep the bolts engaged, and I threw it back in the arena against the Hammerst, which is yet another hammer robot. This one is built by Steve and driven by his son Nate, and it is an overhead hammer robot.
2, 1, fight! Ben's a bit low to the ground.
Yeah, Temporal displacement is already having drive problems, the wheel's almost falling off. Oh, he's weird buggers.
Bear in mind that they've all been in about 3 fights each by this point. Get away from the pit. Yeah, he's having connection problems. No, the other one.
I think both robots have some issues here. Looks like Hammerst up.
So you can see it's a kid driving it.
Yeah, that's it.
So imagine being able to be that age and fighting with a robot this big and powerful. They're surprisingly more difficult to drive than they look. Hit. The weapon's not working. Oh, the weapon might not be working.
Come on. This one doesn't matter, they can do it fine. Alright, 30 seconds left in this match. And either robot push their opponent into the pit. Both of their weapon systems have failed. Alright, everyone count with me. 10 seconds left. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
So, before we talk about this fight, yes, I did have the angle grinder working again, and that was because of, well, hot glue. Hot glue, basically. I hot glued the cast aluminium head of the angle grinder back together. I also put some zip ties all the way around it, through its own chassis and up across the top. I hot glued down my zip ties and I bolted it back on the same way it had been bolted before. And that surprisingly held. It held long enough to get it into the fight and to spin the weapon during the fight. Unfortunately, partway through that fight, the angle grinder just went down, and I don't know why. Still, even now, I don't know why. I pulled the whole robot apart afterwards. It was all still connected. The ESC was still connected. Everything looked okay. It seems as though something has happened in the actual angle grinder itself, and something has broken, potentially, I don't know, maybe even a wire has busted. I haven't actually had a look at it yet. And I might not ever, because again, this whole concept is just bad. And as mentioned at the end of the last fight recap, we did not have the wheel correctly again, so again, we started to lose the wheel in this fight, and that meant I had to be very careful about how I was driving to not fully lose the wheel, but of course, I then fully lost the wheel. It turned out though that the Hammerst was having some kind of drive transmit issue. Again, we were in this big science expo, there was lots of people around, there was lots of Wi-Fi and 2.4 gigahertz stuff floating around, so I was surprised really that more people didn't have interference-y type issues, which seemed like, well, that's what that was with the Hammerst. But of course that meant that I was able to stay in the fight a little bit longer and crab walk my way over to them and just kind of keep harrowing them, even though there was nothing I could really do with no weapon and just one wheel, essentially. However, that meant that there was one draw there. So, Temporal Displacement ended the event on 3 losses and a draw, which is probably the worst I've ever done with a robot. Certainly with a featherweight, I would say. Again, I don't think that this is the way to do a featherweight sportsman, and we do need to get back to Strange Young Man at some point in the future, get a version of Strange Young Man back up and running, and hopefully throw some people around the arena a little bit better and do something just better. However, that was not the final fight for Temporal Displacement, because we did a featherweight rumble at the very end of the day, and basically all the featherweights were thrown into the arena for this one last fight. Except for, unfortunately, the one that I really did want to show you, which was Joel's fantastic pneumatic walker spider robot, Redback. I will throw just a little clip of it here.
Make sure everything works alright.
Welcome to the pit.
It is a beautiful machine with a fully custom 4-piston compressor inside of it to get enough air to run all of those legs. It is a beautiful, beautiful machine, and I wish I could build something like that. Maybe in the future, I don't know, but it was a huge undertaking by Joel, and it was just beautiful, and so much so that I had to at least put some of it here in this video, even though I never managed to fight it, which was a real shame. Anyway, we were talking about the Rumble.
3, 2, 1.
Countdown. 10, 9, 8,
So we did a little bit better in this because I did actually fix the issue with the washers and the wheels, so the wheels were actually connected properly and doing what they were supposed to do. The saw was still down. Again, I still have not managed to pull this thing apart and look at why the saw is no longer working, although the placement of the actual angle we're under means that the saw is currently touching the ground, which is not good, and also it's got a massive bend in the blade now because of that and just running around and just jamming it into other people in the arena. So, you know, this weapon was it's not going to work ever again, basically. It is what it is though, and I had fun in that. I had got a good bit of driving around, poked my business end into people even though it wasn't really doing anything, get to have a front row seat to watch people go flying with Polaris in there throwing people about, which was amazing. It was just a good fun thing, and honestly I wish I hadn't gone down the pit running away from Beast, which was the big blue horizontal saw in there, which was actually quite a nasty thing. It's got a nice little cut in the front armor up here, or the front post up here of temporal displacement. It did a decent amount of damage when it hit people. Anyway, that is going to be it for this particular fight recap. Despite the fact that I was running on very little sleep, I ended up running 4 robots at ARC's Havoc 5. We ran this, we ran Annie, Are You OK? We ran Vogue on Poetry, and we ran Scotland Forever, my robot that I built while I was in Scotland. So, if you want to see the fight recaps for all of those, make sure to subscribe. They will be coming out in the coming weeks, and I hope to see you in the next video.